All right. Well, thank you very much. We've got a really great panel that's ahead. This is a chance for us to explore one of the hottest topics I think that's going to be happening here at the AWS event this week, which is wrapped around the idea of protection, security, data management. Everything that we do, we talk about data gravity, we talk about data latency, whatever the thing you say, data something. But in the end, data has a lot of properties that are valuable to the business. They affect the technology and all the processes wrapped around it. And on top of that, it affects a lot more because what we've got now is we hear more and more about ransomware. We hear more and more about the concept of immutable backups for other purposes other than just actual data, pure data protection, but actually doing live recovery for other development purposes. There really is this incredible opportunity ahead. And so we're lucky because we are joined here by two fantastic folks here who are joining us from Cohesity. And first of all, big shout out because thank you to the Cohesity team for being part of supporting our community event here this week. And you folks are doing a lot. So with that, if you don't mind, we'll let you folks introduce yourself. So we'll start with you, Jed. Lead us out.
Hey, everybody. I'm Jed Wallace. I'm a staff technologist with Cohesity. I've been here for a little bit, and yeah, I'm excited to talk data protection.
And the fun thing too, you're sort of fresh to the Twitterverse and the social verse. Well, so we're breaking you into.
That's right. I'm definitely the noob.
Oh, we're throwing you in right into the fire here for it.
I wouldn't have it any other way. I'd throw me in the deep end. So.
The fun thing I want to do is we'll talk about a bit of your origin story too, because that's actually very interesting in the transition from being on the live customer side to being on the other side of the desk, so to speak, where you're now taking what you learned in the field and being able to give that back in a broad set of customers, which is pretty cool. And I found it's like one of the most profound ways to when you're talking to customers, you get what they're living, because quite often as tech vendors, and I lived this life for almost a decade, we just have this like, oh no, we're solving a complex problem. And it seems like the most important thing in the world. And that's because we sell one thing that does one thing. And that to us is the most important thing in the world, but realizing it's like one iota of the greater day-to-day ops. So there's a lot of neat things we can explore on that one.
You bring up a good point, because that perspective of literally just coming off of the 24/7 administration and engineering side, that really does kind of it's got a nice broad reach to customers. When you talk shop and everything, you kind of understand where they're coming from, because it hasn't been 10 years, since you actually, we're in a data center racking and stacking servers and storage and all that good stuff, right?
I'm getting nostalgia with the data center racking and stacking. I want to continue on with the introductions as we go on, but don't worry, we're going to reminisce about some old times together. We'll beatbox as well. So also here we have Vic, but why don't you do an introduction?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thanks for having us. Right, we look forward to these things. We're excited to be here. So, my name is Vic Camacho. I'm a principal technologist with Cohesity as well, and so essentially, I'm a glorified speaker, glorified storyteller.
He's a guy near and dear to our heart who's very experienced in all this podcasting and conversational side, and he's given us some tips and tricks. And Eric, why don't you do your introduction, and then we'll roll on and get kicking.
Yeah, I have the joy, sort of similar to Jed's story, coming from the customer side. I worked for a couple of decades in financial services, was systems architect, covered the gamut of stuff, and then got into working in the vendor space. Worked with Turbonomic I worked for VM Turbo for 3 years. Then I worked for Turbonomic for 5 years. Then I worked for IBM for 1 year. Funny, I never changed bosses, but I worked at 3 different places, and then now I've launched my own company, GTM Delta, which is kind of cool. So it's neat to have gone through that progression and then come out the other side and shot out into the independent world again, which is kind of neat. And of course, John, you and I worked together for a minute, and we've done a lot of stuff collaborating here. So let's
So a quick introduction. John Myer, Myer Media, content creator, the whole 9 yards. And, I think I'm part of the old school, and I don't feel old, but I'm getting up there in age, and that the nostalgia of talking about data centers and rack and stack. And I've worked in actually a web hosting company where we put the servers into the racks and all the networking on it. And I think that brings a broad experience of what we're going to talk about and how we're going to jump into things. And leading with that, I'm going to let you lead our conversation.
Now, I'm going to start with you, Jed, because sort of carry on what we talked about at the intro, the idea of lived experience, and we've seen a lot of changes in just data management. It's a weird thing, right? We talk about data management, and it's hard to pin down what it means, but let's start there. Like, sort of, first of all, actually, let me, at the very top, let's describe Cohesity, and I'd love to then fit stuff into kind of where you guys are solving a problem. But really, let's work from the data up and how people are using it.
Well, I mean, from my experience, we'll go ahead and we'll talk about Cohesity and what we do. Bringing all your workloads into one central location. That's kind of, to me, that is the nutshell that is Cohesity, right? Because no one else is really doing it. No one else is actually bringing all these different various workloads, no matter where their locale is, whether if it's in the data center, whether it's in the cloud, or it's a remote site. We're going to bring it into one pane of glass. And it may sound simple to some people, but when you come from engineering and administration, it's a big deal, right? Because when you have all these different workloads in all these different areas, it's cumbersome to manage. You're wasting a lot of man hours on this. And believe it or not, just coming off not even a year from the whole 24/7 support roles, right? Backup really is, even in this age of ransomware and everything, is honestly still, with a lot of customers, a afterthought, right? And they don't understand that, yes, backups are not, the sexiest thing, but it's necessary, right? Because if you're hit with a ransomware attack, you have to be able to recover. And with Cohesity, we can help people do that in a very, very efficient and quick manner. So,
yeah, and just to dovetail off of that, I think, it's a lot of this isolated data, right? You have all these silos of data everywhere. And I think it just kind of crept up on everybody, right? Because you have workloads running everywhere now. And, as an organization, if you're, when you're on the other side, it just kind of happens. So now sometimes you don't even know that your teams are using various clouds.
Right.
And so now, you get hit with a bill, and you're
or multiple
you're like, wait a minute,
bills,
or multiple bills, and now you're trying to figure out how we rein this all in, right? There's the budgetary concerns. There's how do you manage data, especially sensitive data, regulatory kind of data that's sensitive data in nature and under regulatory control. And so being able to use something like Cohesity or a system that allows you to bring it all into one to manage it, it's really important today. And I think people are starting to realize that, because audits happen.
Right.
And if they can't effectively, if you can't effectively say, hey, we know where our data's at, and if you don't have some kind of classification or being able to classify that data, discover it, and then tag it, how do you protect it, right? You can't protect what you don't know. And so that's kind of our wheelhouse now. We're trying to do that and trying to help customers manage a lot of that data now.
Do you feel that back then when you had your data centers, everybody understood where your data centers were at, right? You understood you had 2 data centers and you only had to worry about those. Now with the expansion of cloud and multi-cloud, now you have multiple data centers, multiple regions, which are considered data centers. It has grown that they don't understand where their data is actually residing.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's part of it, right? Because now you have things like GDPR, right? Yeah. And putting your data in the cloud, it's going to get replicated to other locations just for fault tolerance purposes. How do you know where it's at? Can the cloud service provider give you that information? Maybe, maybe not. And so I think that's part of being able to understand where your data is at is step one. Protecting is step one, but understanding where it's at is equally important, because you have to be able to rein that all in the case of a ransomware attack, and being able to, or data exfiltration, even worse. So we have to be able to provide that for customers.
Yeah. And I think you mentioning, I mean, a lot of customers, it's a thing where they don't actually know where their data's at. Meaning, like Vic said, that sometimes they're not aware of, I have a copy or a data set in, data center A, and then I have the same set in, say, S3 or something like that. And sometimes the left hand doesn't know what the right is doing. And so I think with Cohesity, we kind of help eliminate that problem with those legacy solutions and kind of bringing it into one platform. So it makes it easier to manage and actually see your data and how it's being protected and how it's being used.
Now, the one thing I if we go now, that's the cool thing, because I think that gives a perfect staging of like, why does it matter to us that are data center operators, cloud operators, especially we're operating hybrid environments. That's just the reality of stuff.
It's not going anywhere.
Right. Whatever we want to call it, it's definitely hybridity is the new normal. And I should have a bumper stick says my other cloud's a hybrid cloud. It's because that's what we've got, and it will be for ad infinitum. In effect, like even as we think we narrow down to one cloud, some other cloud's going to come along, and especially GDPR is interesting because more and more businesses are being affected by this consumer regulatory hit. And, we used to call GDPR the gosh darn, well, we didn't use those words, but gosh darn, privacy regulations, because it's really tough to manage. And then, we had cookie apocalypse. We've got all these things that are trying to like slice down how we get access to data. And then underneath it, none of the systems were prepared for regulatory changes. And this is what we battle with all the time. But more than anything, just like day-to-day operations. We started off when we used to back up a system, it was a server. It was a virtual server. It had a web server, a database on it, maybe middleware, messaging queue, something like that. But that didn't matter. That was transitory data that it's in flight, goes away, no big deal. But now that same server it was virtualized. And then it was two front-end servers with a load balancer, and then it was a middle tier, and then a back-end tier. But now that's going to a database as a service that we've built ourselves, or that's going partly to the cloud, and it's hanging off of something else. So the fundamental patterns have changed. And given that your own background, Jed, calling on your most recent, shift into seeing both sides of it now, what was the progression you saw in just operational patterns for how you built applications?
So I would kind of back up a little bit, and coming off from government, I came off of hardcore security in the last couple of years for election security, believe it or not. And believe it or not, a lot of the decisions that were driving backup, DR, you name it, was public perception.
Right.
So if you said, hey, I want to put a copy of our data in the cloud, of course, you have to explain to people what the cloud is. And, it's just some magical word to some people that it's your data living in the sky somewhere, in Europe. They just don't know that it's just a data center running servers and storage, and it's just in a different geographical location. But I think the biggest issue was honestly perception. So it made the job difficult to kind of move to this hybrid scenario that we're actually talking about, having our data, that 321, having it, having multiple copies in different geographical locations was a hard sell, because, explaining to the public, these are people or voters and et cetera. It's a difficult sell, when you have to kind of get into the politics of things. And I came off of that, and it did make the job a little more difficult these days, because you have one side, everyone's like security. We have municipalities and, clerk of courts and everything, getting hit with ransomware, and they want you to respond, but then you got one hand tied behind your back because of perception. So it's definitely a balance of moving into this hybrid scenario where you can actually kind of manage, having your data in the cloud and on-prem. So
based on that, we're effectively still in transition. We're going to be in transition for a long time, really.
Absolutely.
It's hard to imagine, like we keep saying we're here. You're like, no, we've got one toe in the water, basically.
Yeah. So we would, with the application side, we were, getting rid of the whole traditional DMZ, right? Where, you have that physical segmentation, right? Say whether it's on a firewall or whether you're using NSX with microsegmentation. We started actually moving, like anything that was a web front end, we started moving to like AWS Elastic Beanstalk, and so anything that was public facing would hit that. And you had it was scalable, super redundant, and so luckily it was kind of an easy sell. And we were kind of at the bleeding edge at my last job, and it was really nice to kind of move away from some of those legacy, scenarios like DMZs and everything. You get like the web front up there. You have load balancer. It's scalable. It'll spin up depending on what resource usage it is, and the developers got used to it, which was great. And all you were really responsible for was backing up the database on the back end, right?
Yeah.
And it was kind of almost just throwaway servers, right? Just spin them up, spin them down, and I don't know, it was really nice.
What's curious too, and what you bring up is the idea that we probably still observe a lot of patterns that we had before. Like I remember when we virtualized firewalls, and I'd virtualized my server environment, and then we had virtualized firewalls, and then we had virtualized the DMZ inside the virtual networking and the virtual server. But yet, I was still asked to set up a 3-node cluster purely for DMZ hosts. I'm like, y'all know that this is going through the same physical wire to the top of rack switch.
That's right.
Like there's VLANs,
Yeah.
That's what's actually protecting us. But yet we were still being asked to like put it in a box. And by being in a separate rack, in a separate virtual server with the same back-end networking, it was this perception of safety.
I think you just touched on that as the perception of safety, the perception that we all once had that things are still operating in the same way, in the same methodology that they used to be, right? So nothing has progressed. Some of us have progressed, right? We've adopted the cloud. We understand the cloud. We know that it's here to stay, right? We're not afraid to kind of move to where the education of those who are used to things the way they were, and they want to keep doing that, and they want to understand it. I think you touched on it for the developers going with Elastic Beanstalk is that they realize that this is freaking cool. Like this is going to work for us. We need to start doing the rest of this. Vic, are you saying the same thing? Like, kind of progressing forward with them in the education model that understanding cloud is the value. There's a lot of value there.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we've been talking about, at least for those of us that have been in the vendor space, we've been talking about cloud for years now, right? 2008, 2010 timeframe. We understood it was going to take some time to get there, right? Just like virtualization, right? It took time to finally get people to buy into it, IT leadership to buy into it. It's the same with cloud. And the way I would explain it is, do you use Gmail today? Well, your email's in the cloud. Do you use O365? That's in the cloud. So there's still a transition. I don't think we'll ever get to just complete cloud, right? All workloads in the cloud. I think new companies will, because it's a little more cost effective for them until they get to scale. And then they have to start thinking about, well, do we bring some of this back on-prem and keep some in the cloud where it makes sense? I think that's what we're going to have. I don't think we're going to get away from the hybridity of it. I think it's always going to be some kind of hybrid environment. But I think the acceptance is there more. They're seeing the value. You're never going to beat a hyperscaler in being able to scale up and scale down as you need. You can't do that with your on-premises environment. So there are some pros and cons there. But I think to that degree, it's going to be, the older legacy organizations out there have started to adopt it, just not as frequently as the newer upstart companies that are coming out, because they understand it right off the bat, and they can start from scratch, and they don't have this large migration of data that they have to do.
How are you approaching customers that are either already fully in the cloud, hybrid, or thinking about either both or whatever it is from a Cohesity standpoint, right? You enter somebody and they're like, hey, listen, we're worried about our stuff. Okay, so what does that really mean? Or we want to protect our stuff. How do I visualize my stuff? I've got multiple regions, or I've got multiple data centers. But how are you kind of approaching that from a scenario portion where customers still want to move from their data center to the cloud?
Well, I mean, we can help migrate some of that, right? Because we already work with AWS today, right? We can help protect some of those workloads, like the RDS,
EC2,
C2, and so we can do those things today. So if they are looking to migrate some of that stuff over, it's really easy, right? It's just being able to see it with our Cohesity system and then just help migrate some of that over. So that part of it's already there. I don't know if, I mean, off the top of my head, I don't know which who we'd work with in that regard. But we support the cloud today, right? So
Right.
it's an easy migration effort. It's time
Yeah.
consuming. You have to plan for it, but the steps are pretty well laid out now.
Yeah, because you can back up existing workflows and then you can relocate them into the cloud, right? Cohesity kind of really does a good job of that. So,
And the good thing is that, sorry, we just lost our network for a moment there. As we see the patterns changing of the way that applications are being built, the good news is it allows us to revisit and get, like, the developers tend to have to approach the ops team and say, like, hey, we need a new server. We're using a new service. They're asking for firewall rules. They're asking for different types of connectivity. And that allows us to be like, oh, why are you doing that? And now you're kind of going back to the requirements phase again with stuff, because we've had these workloads that live for so long, and then we moved them around, we virtualized them, and then that was it. They just kind of like, they just moved around on the plate, same number of cookies, but
right.
we just moved them around on the plate. But now it's new plates, new cookies, totally fundamental pattern shift. And it gives us a chance to say, like, all right, let's go back to the drawing board on how we build an operational pattern now to, like, manage that, the data lifecycle, the application lifecycle. Because now this is the problem. The data lifecycle doesn't match the application anymore. It used to be you'd protect a server, something goes sideways, restore the server, whammo, state 0, done. But now you're like, oh, I have a 5-tiered application, right? It's got 3 levels of, mid-tier key value stores and all this stuff. And, like, so if I snap 7 servers, how do I understand application consistency and application state if I don't even understand how it is? So we now have to, like, talk to the developers, figure out what the patterns are, and then when we recover an application, which is what we're really recovering, way different. So it's, operationally, like, again, like, how does that look in your people you're talking to? Are you seeing more people that are, like, moving to these distributed application patterns?
I could speak for myself, being that I just kind of, like I said, to just reiterate, I'm coming, just coming off the engineering and administration side. So, I bring it back to perspective. We have a data set, and there's PII in there and everything. And so they don't want that data in the cloud. So you end up with your SQL databases on premise, and then we have the front end or the application side in AWS. So you'll see some places like us at one time, of course, where you're using two different backup products to back up the cloud portion, and then you're using another backup product to back up the on-prem, and which kind of leads us into what Cohesity does is bring those workloads into one place. I know we're kind of going to beat that drum a lot, I think, but I think it's worth saying. So,
well, and I mean, that in effect is the pattern that we need to follow. Is, like, I think of it as like the application versus the infrastructure. But if we actually play it out to its logical conclusion, it means we have to have one single place in which we can go to understand the state of all parts of the environment.
That's right.
Yep.
Including data lifecycle, including application placement, including, data placement. There's so many moving parts. And the only way you can understand that state is to have one central place in which you can go to that has an awareness of where this stuff lives.
And there's inefficiencies when you kind of bring it back to the DevOps world. There's inefficiencies about actually kind of getting the most value for that data. I know that might sound a little markety, but
sorry, I've worked in marketing a long time.
Yeah. And I'm not, I'm an engineer. I'm not a marketing person, but working the last 6 years was mainly in DevOps / security, because you get thrown into that, especially when you work in elections. Was working with these people to kind of redefine how they do things, right? So, I don't know what your experience is with that, Vic.
Well, I think, to Eric's point, right? Having a single platform, or at least a unified view of everything, right? Not to say the single pane of glass, but that's exactly what it is, right? It's just one place where you can see all your data. Having all those workloads under one platform so that where everything is at, being able to back up to the cloud, being able to protect workloads that are living on-prem. I think that's what you're going to need, and being able to protect the workloads and being able to secure the workloads as well. it's one of those value adds that you can't live without today. Given today's threat landscape, you have to be able to secure the data. And I spent 3 years over at High Trust, which was just deep cybersecurity. So I know for those of us that are on this side of the fence, it's very normal to us. We can have these conversations, but for someone that's in the customer space, it's a little more difficult because that's not what they do day to day. And so it's our job to help them understand that. And having that platform is going to help simplify a lot of those things for IT leaders and IT practitioners alike.
So Vic, Eric touched on it a little bit for the data lifecycle policies. And coming from the traditional data center background, man, I feel a little nostalgic every time I say that. Thank you, Jed, for bringing back.
You call it nostalgia, I call it PTSD.
Well, hey, what are you doing afterwards? I'm sure they're going to need a couple, right? So talking about those and defining those workloads that you're backing up, do you remember back then, and everybody did a different method. Okay, so this is a platinum level, and we did a gold, bronze, and silver, and then, whatever's left, or t-shirt sizes. Mm-hmm. And I defined my backup strategy based off of these. Oh, this application is platinum. We need to back it up every hour on the hour. And then how easy is it to define this and to have a clear view of these types of application? Or is everybody in the same type of spectrum? Like, we're doing everybody because the cost is the same no matter what.
Well, I mean, the cost may not be the same, right? But, how much storage do you have? All those questions start to come into play. But it's being able to identify what kind of workloads you have. Some are going to be mission critical, some are not. And so, for those policies, like gold policies, right, you're going to want your mission critical data there. For those that may not have stringent requirements or may not have as sensitive data, you want to maybe use a silver policy for that. But being able to understand what kind of data you have by classification, right, and tagging the data and then moving it to a more secure location, right, and creating those trusted, I call them a trusted zone versus an untrusted zone, where you can get more granular controls over it, is going to be very helpful. So you can still do that. It's very easy. It's very easy to define within the Cohesity system already. So it's not a very difficult thing to do.
Is that still the right methodology to do, or kind of way to handle things, or has that changed? Because granted, that's the old way we used to do things, right? You defined it, and I won't name some platforms that we utilize for it, but like, oh, you went on this node versus this node handled your traffic, and these are the old data center things. Is there a new way that you think that we should define those or look at some of those in the cloud or hybrid?
I think in years past, I think it would matter more, just because it seemed like every year there was a vendor that was just increasing their speed, right? Compute feeds and speeds. And today everything is fast. So it doesn't really matter as much. I think it's there as part of the old, mentality. So I think that's going to exist for some time, but
just to help us old folks still have.
For those of us that are north of 50, maybe.
Well, we have this funny thing. My favorite saying is, you call it legacy, I call it production. Like we really have this unfortunate thing. And like single pane of glass, we've made it a bit of a dirty word. It's a pejorative in tech, especially in the vendor space. We kind of chuckle like, it's a single pane of glass, but it's more like a common gateway by which we manage a thing. It's because single pane of glass sounds very, like it's one sort of super portal, like a CRM thing you'd have. But really what it is more than just visibility. It's a control point. Other systems will consume the systems. It's like the API thing. It's like, I would ask every vendor that would come into my, to tell me about their platform, I would ask them, do you have, a fully publicly available RESTful API and where it's fully documented? I was never going to be sitting there, carving out API calls. But no. What I wanted to know was they were thinking about this as a manageability feature, so that when other adjacent platforms started to tap into the service, we have API-driven methods by which we can access and manage the content that's managed by this adjacent system.
I think that's where one place where Cohesity definitely excels is with our marketplace, right? And it's all API-driven, and all the partnerships we've made over the past several years, to me is pretty impressive, right? Yes, I've officially drunk the Kool-Aid, and it's for a good reason though, because I mean, I think Vic was talking about in his one of his presentations today. And I won't name any names, but basically, trying to bring the security team and the admin team and the dev teams kind of together. And you might already have some kind of existing platform or for security and doing investigations and all that kind of stuff when it comes to ransomware, and having that to be able, having that integration with our product and having all this all the big players as partners. I think it really gives you, bringing it back to added value to your data. And I was drawing a blank earlier when I started talking about DevOps, is that the getting your bang for the buck, I think is really something where we also excel, because you can, yes, it could be difficult to get the devs to kind of do things a different way, a more efficient way, because they're so used to doing it a certain way, even though to me, or to maybe you it might be inefficient, where you can actually, instead of spinning up a new VM in a lower environment with a copy of a database from production, blah blah blah, they want to run queries against it, this, that, and the other. You could just do that from your existing backup data, and so you're getting more value and use out of it, as opposed to just, hey, this is my backup data, it's there, I feel protected, right? You're actually doing something with it, and as well as analytics and and again the marketplace and all that other stuff, so you can actually see what's happening with your data, especially in that security space, right?
Well, we're definitely an open, an API first driven organization, right? So we do, just to talk about a little bit what Jed was mentioning, is being able to partner or integrate, third party integration with, security partners that's in their wheelhouse. So why would we try to reinvent the wheel, right?
Yeah,
Let's
absolutely.
partner with these folks, get your IT ops and your SecOps to be able to work more closely together. Oftentimes, your incident response teams, your security operations teams, they have their own set of tools. IT ops has their own set of tools, and there's a lot of overlap there, but they don't know what they're doing, right? What each other's doing. And when you have that integration, they can work a little more closely together. You can have your security operations folks kick off a job from their systems that actually tie in with our system at Cohesity, and kick off an instant mass recovery as an example, so that you can recover in mass, right? And this is really just to satisfy business continuity requirements, right?
Yeah.
And move at the speed of their own SLAs. So if you can, when you have that collaboration, then it's a little easier. Everybody knows what they're doing, and you have essentially the collaboration going there.
Yeah, it's bringing it back to the left hand knowing what the right hand's doing.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
That's not always the case.
Well,
So,
even just the fact that we had to call this practice DevSecOps, and people are like, why do we have to say sec in the middle? I'm like, because we didn't invite them to the requirements discussion.
right.
Like we really have. But the interesting thing, I think, is that we developed operational patterns, like the concept of instant immutable backups that we could then use for development purposes, or it was for like snap recoveries or quick storage for like intraday snapshots. And I know snapshots are not backups, whatever it means, but just as a general way, like a general protection point at which you could quickly roll back to. And what was funny or ironic or peculiar, whatever, was that we were suddenly opening the door to a security pattern that, when we saw ransomware become a thing, I was like, oh, wait a second, this the same practice we've got where like rapid immutable snaps could give us a point where we can capture something that's happening on the fly for investigation. We could stop something, we could detect a pattern. But because we built the framework to do this, because you've designed the system to be able to be like, I can just run this command and immediately, that's it, everything in this section is now immutable, then you're instantly protected. You have a rollback point to previous, incremental, whatever it's going to be. Mm-hmm. But what started off as how do I protect my intraday backups? All of a sudden you're like, ooh, if I use the same idea, I can programmatically trigger. So maybe you've got like a security partner and they said, hey, we've detected inbound a ransomware detection. And then that platform via the marketplace could be like, all right, whoosh, snap it all. And it's funny that we accidentally discovered this great recovery pattern. And, I think that's the right.
Snap it all. And,
exactly.
And lock all the backups. Nobody touches anything, because that's the first thing they're going for with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the immutable, the immutability is great, right? Being able to sandbox that off then and being able to do forensics on it is key. I think most security operations want to do forensics on, the ransomware or whatever breach happened. Being able to cordon that off with immutability so that they're still protected is a good thing to have, right? I think most security operations today want to do some type of forensics and not just delete something and then move on. They need to understand how it happened, why it happened, when it happened, who made it happen. And so having that capability is a good thing to have.
Yeah, I mean, you see all the big players, rushing to put in virus and malware scanning when you do backups, right? And it's definitely about playing keep up. So as far as technology and keeping your data secure, so
Well, and I what I really like is that the team and the platform approach is like, if you go back to like the first appearance in the market, it's always funny if there's like the go to market, the first thing you have is like obviously like backup. Sometimes they're appliance based and they become software based. And when you really read into it, if you enter sort of the ethos of the way the platform was developed and designed, you're like, oh yeah, like we're finally now, however many years in, reaching what the founders wrote however many years ago. It takes a long time because you have to sell a thing, you have to develop and market, and then you sort of kind of grow into your pants of
Metamorphosize.
Yeah. So it's nice to see that it play out. And looking back at the early phase of how there's a lot of also rans in the market, and in any market. I'm not calling out this in particular, but it's just we have this. Ransomware becomes a thing, and so all of a sudden everybody's a ransomware protection product, and you're like, well, but was the platform designed in its core to handle this kind of thing? It just so happens that this is a fantastic use case versus like, oh, I'm going to just start putting ransomwares and just for the record, no hackers sit there with one hand and a hoodie, like that's that same like stupid stock footage we use for the secure,
I love that stock footage. I actually use some Instagram. I'm not using it anymore anyway.
I think, one thing that I was used to was, again, won't mention any vendors, but, they would just, as opposed to working and, to have partnerships and, bringing those APIs to work together, they would just make acquisitions. Right. And as opposed to, I wasn't used to the model that Cohesity kind of, brought to me. I was always used to, hey, this vendor bought, these X, Y, and Z startups to, kind of just make their code mesh together, which only, turns into some kind of Frankenstein, as opposed to, where to me, it's a lot more thoughtful when you're working with these partners and, we're both getting something out of this partnership. Right. So I would say we're also getting something a little more eloquent, as far as,
Yeah. I mean, there's the whole, acquiring a company and making it mesh. And sometimes it's a necessity, right? I mean, some organizations that's not in their wheelhouse, and so they acquire something they can't. If they do have it, then they're going to code it. And, they'll code for it and build it all in. I think Cohesity has done a pretty good job at creating a lot of that, right? Mohit Aaron being the founder and bringing all that experience he had from Google, right?
Yeah.
So kind of building the same platform in that manner so that everything can run on it. Like Google can run YouTube, it can run Gmail, all those things. We're trying to do the same thing at Cohesity. And I think you're seeing the fruition of that now.
It feels like, they say it takes a village, right? And that's what this feels like to me, as opposed to bringing it back to where, we're a multi-billion-dollar company, not Cohesity. I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about, other companies. And just kind of, taking, getting these little guys, taking what we need from them and kind of meshing our stuff together. It's kind of odd to me, and I'm still surprised by it. It's just like seeing companies work together, right? I mean, it's just, it's not something that I'm used to, right? That's not something that I've had a lot of experience with. So it's actually kind of refreshing, honestly. So.
Now let's talk about we hinted to before. We've all talked about sort of the unsexiness of what we do. Like, That's why they talk about the new kingmakers. It's not about the fine folks in operations that are backing your data up. It's always about some kid in a hoodie that just developed a new application that's going to take the world by storm. But yet it's oxygen. I'd always used to talk in disaster recovery of like an oxygen services, and people are like, what do you mean by? I'm like, Active Directory, simple things like, how do you just get the lights on to start with? This is the baseline. Everything reboots. Okay, let's make sure the hull of the ship is solid. Perfect. Get the base lights on. Start the engines. Like, it's unsexy, but
until you need to recover, and then it becomes the sexiest thing you need.
But it's the last thing that I think people approach is the recovery aspect. They're like, yeah, I got all my backups, I got all this stuff ready to go, right? I know it works. You know what? We don't need to test it out. And then all of a sudden,
that's the worst statement ever.
That's right. Seriously.
We don't need to test recoveries at all, right?
But you just feel happy and secure. Listen, I click the backup thing, it works, right?
Yeah.
And when it comes time to it, what happens? You spend a week trying to recover that one file and realize, I should have tested this out. I should have went through my process. It should have been a click of a button and restore, but they didn't really realize the whole process behind it. And the whole thing that it took to actually do the steps that they thought they could do with one click.
Yeah. Is it just a snapshot, or does it have granular recovery, right? Whether it's a file server,
education on what they're backing up.
That's right.
I mean,
yeah, if it's just a Windows file server and you're just doing a regular snapshot, well, you're not, it makes it a little more difficult to kind of reach in and just get that one little needle in that haystack that you
grab
need.
it, mount it, pull it out.
That's right. Yeah.
And now I just restored 10,000 gigabytes of data for this 1 megabyte of file.
That's right.
But don't worry, I got back your Excel spreadsheet.
Unfortunately, that's kind of still how it goes for a lot of companies. So I can attest to that for sure. So you're right. You need to test your backups thoroughly. You need to, get on a schedule, quarterly, monthly, whatever it is, depending on the criticality of your application and the data that, you're housing. So
Bill Belichick would have said, do your job.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what it comes down to.
All right, so now we're quoting. Well, all right.
I know that intimately because I work for a Boston-based company, and of course, in the proper ways, like, do your job. It's always got to sound
much better.
Like John F. Kennedy said it. Go pack your car. But
yeah, you lost me on the sport analogy. If it's not Gryffindor or Hufflepuff,
all right. I'm good. But let's say if you're not Slytherin, you better be Slytherin out. That's the only house that matters.
That's right.
Take your Hufflepuff body out of here.
No muggles allowed.
There you go.
There we go.
Well, alrighty then.
We just went into a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Wait, what are we talking about? All right,
but business continuity, I think, that's really what we're after. We talk like that's backups. Right. Unfortunately, have this again, it's almost like a pejorative, backups. But it's business recovery, it's business continuity, and we even used to stop saying disaster recovery, mostly because it sounded kind of gross and it had a very negative connotation. But business continuity is how do we deal with various levels. Disaster recovery sort of had this assumption that, all right, whoosh, gone.
Here comes the hurricane.
Right, something that was major, but business continuity is a continuous, multi-tiered, multi-leveled kind of recovery process, right?
It is, and I think DR, disaster recovery, is just one part of that, right? There's all this documentation and processes that have to be put in place.
Your run books.
Yeah. But, it's understanding, business continuity as a whole. And for organizations, that's really what it's about, right? Being able to continue business operations. Some small to medium-sized SMBs, if they're down for 3-4 days, some of these folks have to shutter doors, never to open again. So it becomes, for those type of organizations, it's of paramount, importance, because business continuity is their life's blood, and so they have to be able to continue. That you make a good point, Eric,
and the idea that it's a very human driven, and it's software that manages it, it's software that controls it. But if you don't have the human driven policies to manage it, in the end, like I said, it was run books, and we all laughed so hard at that because I'm like, oh yeah, I know that one. Well, your run book, which was electronic, then printed with a Post-it note, and then a Sharpie over the step 3, and make sure you do this twice because it doesn't work every time. like those run books, when we put those into platform, into that entry gateway, that one common gateway in which we manage data as a unit, across every part of the environment. That's the goal. Like, how do we take human processes, render them in software process, and then there's still a human decision. I mean, as much as I automated business continuity with multiple platforms over the decades I've been working, as you can tell by the frown lines and gray hairs, when it all came down to it, something goes completely sideways. And if automation was really driving, it'd be like, all right, flip it all over. And in the end, you're like, no. Like, we always say 4-hour recovery, but what if it's 4 hours and 10 minutes? Do you really fail over the entire data center at 4 hours? Or do you make a human decision? So we really still have to have like one-click capabilities, but that we can interact with through other systems.
You can automate until the cows come home, but there's always going to be an element of manual process just for that peace of mind. Is this really going to go the way I think it's going to go? Right? You can write it down and wish for the best, but you need to approach it in a way where you definitely test it and make sure it works. And
I think you're touching on that. It explicitly is talking about that manual process. Think about how we define the data lifecycle for like those platinum or gold level servers. Right. This high end application, am I going to want it to be automatically failed over and restored? Or do I want a human just saying, I'm not sure. Wait, let's restore it over here and test it out real quick before we do it, because they didn't test it ahead of time. But you just don't want to. Oh, we're going to touch on the whole business continuity, DR, and, actually restoring a file and what's the value of it, because people need to be educated on that. But do you really enact a manual restore and then, oh my God, it restored everything and I only wanted one file, right?
Yeah, you definitely you need to be mindful. That's really all I could say on that.
So it needs a conversation.
It does.
Every single piece of application that you're doing, below a certain level needs a conversation on the level of human interaction and automation implied into it.
I mean, it really does come back to just education, knowing your environment, knowing your data, knowing where it's at, what it's doing. I think that's really the first step, right? Is just knowing and having that education about your data, what it's doing, and how are you going to recover, and do you want this fully automated? Stuff can definitely go wrong when you fully automate.
Well, yeah,
failover and things like that.
Yeah, it's understanding, right? It's awareness. You can't automate everything out. There's just no way, right? There's, even automation can have errors in it, right? Because we're prone to error. But to what you were saying, Jed, it's really about understanding what kind of data you have, where it's at. I keep coming back to that, and also which data is actually critical, right? Everybody thinks their data.
My dev application that's legacy hanging on with a single server is very critical that I need up all the time.
HR and accounting's 80 gig Excel file that they should have a SQL database for, right? I mean, that's a common one.
On my desktop,
that's right.
That's right.
It's on my desktop. So we don't do Roman profiles anymore because user XYZ has got an 80 gig desktop loading, right? So.
And we used to have this. Wow. I always love when you do business continuity and you have to assign a cost or a price to it, because I did internal like funny money chargeback for the services. And people would say like, oh, what tier is your application? Like, oh yeah, it's tier 1. And you're like, okay, cool. And like, well, because it would be based on an RPO and RTO settings, and then based on that, and then you would say, okay, well then it's going to cost this much to manage the application. Like, let's go with tier 2. And you're like, okay, but like, was it tier 2 because you don't want to pay for it, or is it tier 2 because as a business rule you can get away with it? And they'd say, well, at tier 2 you're allowed 8 hours of downtime. And we're like, okay, but what if the 8 hours is say Monday 8 a.m. until Monday 5 p.m. and they're like, oh no, that can't be. I'm like, it's tier 1 then. But we're fighting with like cost of operations. It's a real set of trade-offs, right?
Cost is a huge deal because say in the DevOps world, right, you always have multiple environments, right? You have your lower environments, the application needs to go through, dev, test, staging, and then production, right? And then a lot of times with staging and production, you like those to be identical. And so they want to treat that staging environment, which there is a cost, right? The disk space, the hosts and everything like that. It costs money. So you're duplicating the cost of staging that you want to be exactly like production, and you want to treat it like tier one. I mean, there are these, like you said, there's these trade-offs. You got to, a lot of times they need to understand that, the bucket has a bottom, right? It's not, it's that there's not this, pit of money that we could just grab and be like, hey, all your low environments, we treat them like production. No problem.
Oh, it's all important.
Yeah,
it's all important until they see the cost.
I think it's back to the education that we're talking about,
Right.
is that the developers and the application owners who are handling this stuff, where they think, obviously their application is the only thing they're concerned about. They are tier one no matter what, but they don't realize that there's a cost associated that trickles down to the entire company, and understanding the value of, hey, listen, you're going to have 2 hours of downtime. No, it can't happen. I need a rapid response. Do you know this is an environment that I've really analyzed that you only use for 1 hour a week?
Yep.
Well, I need it for that 1 hour. Okay, but the cost that you're doing it, and it's the education, the conversation that's solely around it. Eric, you've touched on it, is that everything that we're talking about here drives around the cost of what their application is going to do. What kind of backups, what kind of retention, what kind of RPO, RTO that they want tied to this application. And the conversation that we're having is the cost associated with it. They're like, well, I'm not paying the bill. I'm not worried about it. But in the end, everybody is associated to it.
When there's cost beyond just like raw dollar cost, like that's obviously huge, but by trying to get around that raw dollar cost, we often make performance trade-offs. So we'll use other methods. And I mean, I always think of like sort of like that Anakin meme where it's like, you did this thing, right? And like, right, and they'll say like, I've been taking snapshots every, 5 hours for safety. And they said, oh, you get rid of the interim snapshots though, right? You get rid of the interim snapshots, right? Because what happens, all of a sudden you look at like, why do we have 4 terabytes for this web server? Oh, because I'm taking snapshots every hour and never getting rid of the old ones. So it's like these continuous iterative, we're trying to cheat the system, but never going back to like, what's the first principles? What are we actually trying to do? And because the performance trade-offs are disturbing, and just the capacity trade-offs, and like, it's a huge risk. And time again, we like, let's take a snapshot, and snapshots are not backups, but like even as a protective mechanism for operations, upgrades, if we don't go back and check where that is, and we like move it to another data center, put it in another region, whatever, just for like, we're doing an upgrade, and we forget. And that's why, again, like this idea of like one portal, one common pain.
He's trying not to use the word in this conversation.
You end up having 40 terabytes of staging data in AWS 3 that it's been there for 9 months. And then when somebody says, what is this bill? It's not going to go to the developer. It's going to go to the engineer and the administrator, from the exec to us directly. And they're going to ask those questions. The dev world, I love them. They're needed, obviously, but sometimes there's that disconnect between, what is doable, So like you said, there's always a cost attributed to all these things. And it's our jobs as engineers and administrators to take in security and costs into everything we do. So
I call those breadcrumbs, but those are expensive breadcrumbs.
They are.
Yeah. Wow, that's a good analogy for it, because I think what happened when we were in the data center, and yes, I keep coming back to that. Thank you, Jed. I'm going to go hug one after this. But I think we keep coming back to it, is that they never had to worry about the cost because it was associated over a 5-year term, right? I bought this data's here and I have to expand it. But now it's back into the developers and the engineers' hands for the cost to make sure that when they set this, I mean, I love the 4,000 terabytes, 4,000 terabytes worth of web server data that I'm holding for the lifelong that it's been up for the last 6 years, is that now you have to realize and visualize that I set this. I feel so great. I've got 5 hours. Every 5 hours, I got the snapshot, but you haven't deleted it. Oh, I know I might need 6 years worth of data, but there's no retention policy that needs that. Yeah. So understanding what you're doing to save these backups, but the retention now comes along with the education, and that you need to clean things up. Yes, the cloud is huge. We can store massive amounts of data, but do you really need it?
No.
Yeah,
And
I always ask, like, where are you getting that retention number from? What's the requirement?
I forgot to click the button.
I think the word that, I don't hear a lot, which we should, is sprawl. I mean, when you have data sets or copies of data sets, it's exact same data sets, and you have it at multiple locations, and then you just forget about it, and then guess what? Some Joe Schmo in accounting is just paying the bill, right? So as opposed to knowing what data you have and where it's at, and saving your company or organization thousands of dollars in, say, cloud costs or storage, they just keep paying the bill. And I've seen it before, and that's why I bring it up. So, again, education, knowing what you have and where you have it, and, kind of getting rid of that data sprawl, right? So, and bringing it back to Cohesity and taking advantage of your data can save you a lot in cost, because you're just using data that you already have, right? You're just making, you're just adding value to that data, and you're just reusing it. And,
and you're moving your policies into that same platform.
That's
Again,
right.
Not just about visibility, but truly about management, which I think is what we see backup as just like, it's a thing that goes on. And like we talk about visibility. Visibility is incredibly important, but visibility without an actionable way in which you can interact with it, it's kind of pointless, right? I could have, one spreadsheet that pulls all this data into one spot, but if I can't interact with it, it's just any platform is like that. So giving visibility, I could put one monitor and just put 4 windows on it. I got one for this cloud, one for this cloud, one for this cloud, one for my data center. Great. I've got visibility.
That is a single pane of glass, by the way.
Yes. But something goes wrong. Well, now what do? Well, I have to go to 4 places to do something about it. And that's the pattern change.
And we're not talking about a small chunk of change when we're talking about low environments, because a lot of times, yes, they have to be identical to production. And, what I'm trying to get at is that with you obviously using Cohesity, I would like to get the DevOps world to where they're kind of eliminating these lower environments and making use of the data they already have that's being backed up, right? Not only is it more efficient, it's safer, and you're saving a lot of money. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars a year in, compute resources and storage, and reining that in, I think it could save people a lot of money, so.
And it's a chance for us to go again back to first principles of like, what is it you're trying to achieve by the way you're doing this today? Are you like, you have 5 environments? Why do you have 5 environments? Like, because I have to do canary deployments, and I'm doing, like, we're getting smart. We're doing DevOps. We're doing blue greens, and all this. Okay, that's great, but we've got a better way you could do that, and that I think this is where we're a few years out of complete adoption of it, but we have to kind of go back and like knock on the door, like, there's programmatic ways that we can deliver this to you, instead of you having to like slice a hunk of data, copy it over here, and they've got all these goofy Perl scripts running somewhere just because they got a library of that somewhere.
I mean, what about the human element, right? I mean, that's another cost we don't talk about, is that the people who have to manage this sprawl, all these 8 different environments and 4 different data centers, where you can actually rein that into one platform, and you're saving money on the human element, people.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question has to be asked, like, what is the requirement? Why are we doing this? Right? I think at least I'm putting my consulting hat back on.
Yeah,
that's the first thing I'm like, well, it depends. What are you trying to do? What's the requirement? A lot of time they have lofty goals, and without understanding what the business requirement is, and based off the business requirement, that'll predicate what the technical use cases become. And I think that's one of the elements, right? Again, education and awareness. And so that's where I always start with, and that's where I always kind of my go-to, like, why do we need this?
And especially if you've got that idea, they'll say like, well, why do you take, snapshots every 30 minutes? Well, because my recovery point has to be every 30 minutes. So like, but that this system gets data dropped into it from another system that actually has the data. This is actually a dump spot for read-only data that's coming from somewhere else. Why are you snapshotting read-only data that's already existing in another place?
Elsewhere.
And I think that's, again, like we go back to put that hat on of go to requirements, go to first principles. What are we trying to achieve? Because if we don't keep revisiting this stuff, it's easy for them and to think that they're stuck. As an application builder, I'm like, I have to build this logic into my code, into the way that I build my app. They don't realize that there's so many better ways that we can interact with them on the ops sides to give them what they actually need.
Vic is talking about it, and you guys have mentioned it a bunch of times. In fact, asking the requirements, not just jumping in there. Yeah, we can handle it. Let's just do it. But really understanding the customer aspect and what they're trying to achieve. Don't just implement something and say, yeah, we can do all this stuff. You guys really want to know and understand everything from nuts to bolts about the application. The business requires, not because the developer in this group would like, a 30-minute retention and recovery, and this group wants 60 minutes. Oh, but our data sprawled all over everything, and, kind of understanding of things. You want to understand going into each application and the value of those applications and the recovery, and not only the actual the data residing in it, but what type of data do you want to recover versus a snapshot versus granular data, and then you can come up with a solid plan to actually achieve these results.
Yeah, I think that's accurate, and I I think it really kind of boils down to putting that consultant hat back on is actually care. Just caring about what you're actually doing, right? So I think going in as a consulting and kind of looking at the environment, what they have and how they're doing things, if you care, you're going to want to save them money and time and resources, right? Because that's your job, that's what you're getting paid to do. And sometimes it's easier to just say okay and just and then just give me a check, right, as opposed to actually taking the time to know their environment, their data set, their priorities, their recovering times and all the, their SLAs and all that other good stuff. So
I think, and as we kind of wrap up here, I want to pick on one thing that's important from the other side of it. We've talked this, Jed, about your operator up. So you've moved into the vendor space, and Vic, you and I talked a lot, and we've been around the vendor ecosystem, you even longer than me, and you've done a lot in a lot of places and had a very profound effect on my understanding of how to be effective as a vendor and wear that customer consultant hat all the time. And, I've mad respect to you always and how I've learned a lot from you over the years and watch how you interact. Your email address means less to me than your approach to things, right? We've changed companies over time sometimes, but the consultative approach, how do you feel right now? You've been here for a while, and the Cohesity approach seems to really they like that. And I feel, how consultative can you get, and how do you feel about, where the customers are and being able to say hey, we need help, not just to be sold a renewal license?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it stems from, at one point I was in a customer space and had a lot of the challenges that Jed had. And then moving into a consulting role, and then a technical account management role, and then into a pre-sales role, right? And then a field CTO role. So you understand the various aspects of the business, right? One is marketing, one is sales, one is, support, and one is professional services. But I come back to that because it's being able to understand the customer first, right? I always go back to understanding the requirements, much to the chagrins of my sales guys sometimes. But
yeah. Unfortunately, well, and it's we often joke too when people say oh, I'm a field CTO. I'm like, you're in sales. I'm in technical marketing. You're in sales.
Right.
But it is important, and I think that we have this funny thing that we try and say we're not in sales because we're technologists at heart.
Yeah.
And that's why even what we're doing here is getting closer to the technologists. In the end, we do know we have numbers we got to hit. We got quotas the company has to do. Otherwise, we don't get to do this stuff. But again, being able to bridge those that line very well. You are among a few people I know that can do that. And Jed, you're already, I can see, customer first. Obviously, you're going to carry the brand strongly, and you look for the capabilities, but it's be customer obsessed. I think is kind of the theme.
Man, I was
that's a
actually
very
going to quote that for AWS.
Exactly.
But I was literally like, man, should I was just going to be like, listen, you guys sound like AWS leadership principles. Number one, customer obsession. So thanks for touching on that. You're reading my mind. Like we actually
Very
work
good.
together.
Because I was going to say the same thing. Like it's very AWS. Right? So we do.
It's like we've done this before.
We've been at this for too long.
Yeah, I think one thing that definitely impresses me about Vic is that he does care, right? And that's not something you see a lot, and not really in technology, right? Because again, sales, you got to meet quotas and all these other things, which is new to me, right, in the vendor space, right? So when you're an engineer or an administrator, it's a little easier to care because your paycheck's not depending on meeting your quarterly quotas and all that.
Yeah, there's no like I didn't do 22 backups this week, so I'm now on a performance improvement plan.
Yeah,
we can handle that really quick. Don't worry. Click that policy.
That's right.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's it just comes down to being able to understand what a customer wants, right, or what they actually need. Sometimes they don't even know what they need. Right, you bring things up, and then all of a sudden the wheels start turning, and like, oh yeah, we didn't even consider that. But I think that brings value to them, and it sets up credibility. And then long term, I think they're going to trust you as that, a thought leader in that space. But you have to be honest. You have to be, bring some value and solve some challenges that they may not have seen before. I think Cohesity bringing in much more of that data security aspect is what folks are looking for. And given today's threat landscape, you have to focus on data security, because if that gets compromised and you have no effective way of recovering, you're going to be hurting, right? Business continuity goes right down the drain.
Yeah. Business continuity is far beyond just like, is it up or down?
Yeah.
It is truly that full, like it continuous security, understanding, as we move into hybrid environments, where do we recover to? But ultimately it's like, what happens if something just goes sideways right now? Even I used to have stuff where like I could do immediate, near real-time replication, and someone says, okay, so what happens, if we have a virus that deletes stuff? I'm like, then we near real-time delete the other destination too. It's fantastic. The near real-time part works all the time. Like,
yep.
Is there a way you can stop that? Like, well, no, but we are at the point where we can do that. We can see those heuristic patterns. And again, what does it come down to? Visibility is cute, but if I don't have one single common place through which I can be a gateway to actionable outcomes and management, and like I said, the partner ecosystem and the humans behind it, it's I'm a fan for sure of how you guys are doing it.
Well, also I think it's part of, and I know we're trying to wind down here, but I think also a lot of the AI and ML, right? Being able to detect anomalous behavior, that technology exists today. So I'm looking forward to where that. To seeing where that really goes now. I think building that kind of intelligence into a system is key, right? I mean, eliminating a lot of the false positives. We heard false positives before, people checking on these alerts that weren't really, credible. And so being able to use a system that can detect that over time is going to be very helpful for both IT ops, security operations.
And I think what I would lastly say is that a trend that I'm happy to see over the past, I'd say 3 to 5 years is that backups are no longer an afterthought. They're actually starting to refocus, organizations are starting to refocus their budgets and understanding that, oh, wait, we kind of need this above all else, or we might not exist as a company. And I think that trend, I hope, continues. Because it's good for business.
It all comes down to basics and foundations.
Yeah,
for
sure.
Especially when we think of how many names end up in the news, and I always say, even as my personal goal in life is to never be referred to as embattled or infamous, either of which tends to mean that something terrible happened that may or may not have been my direct cause. And we see this. We have brand, the brand importance of being safe. Your data is safe, your recovery time is safe, people really recognize that because it happens now. Like I've seen environments that I know that they went through what would have been, OG ransomware, like botnets when stuff like Myer came out, and that stuff. All of a sudden, entire environments would shut down, but we didn't really hear about it. Now it is pervasive. It's going to be on Twitter by the time, or Mastodon.
I was just going to say, by the time this comes out, are you quoting the right platform we're going to be talking on?
Twitter may be gone by the time this publishes, tomorrow.
We'll be back. We'll all be back on MySpace. So, yeah.
Hey, I'm with you on that one.
I for one
Tom
welcome.
My good.
I hope that Tom's still out there and still my friend.
He is laughing, and he's like, "Man, I'm restarting this stuff, and I'll sell it again."
Why not? Yeah.
Anyway,
so Jed, where do we find you if people want to continue this conversation and want to hear what you're doing? Because we want to bring you up to, again, as a new voice in carrying forward what you did on the customer side. You are
you can find me on the Twitterverse while it's still alive, Jed Wallace 78, or you can find me on LinkedIn.
And Mr. Vic,
virtual_Vic. If you're looking for me on Twitter. I'm not recalling my Mastodon handle right now. I'm sure it's some form of virtual Vic.
That is probably difficult for everybody to actually remember their Mastodon and what server they're on. And
that's right.
Spelling it out. I mean, don't get me wrong, but like I said, I have one and I can't spell it out.
I'm going to do what you do, John, is put it on my my Twitter profile.
Isn't that unique? Like, hey, catch me over here if you're looking for me.
So, or on LinkedIn as well. I'm pretty accessible.
And isn't it funny that we all came from the spot? Like even my morning run group is still called VFit, and like your virtual Vic. And I know so many people that are like V something or other, and but it's funny that we came from that environment. And yet before that, I was a Windows Active Directory person, and I was an OpenStack person.
I had server 2000,
but that was pre-Twitter handle. I didn't have to have to pick a thing. But it's funny that we will transcend this over time, and the practices that we brought from that history. It's fun to see it play out, and like I said, we're OG in a lot of ways. Not just because Vic and I are kind of like the grandparents of our community of
Disco Posse, Disco Biscuit.
That's it.
And on the gravy.
There you go. There you go. Well, John, anything you want to say in closing up here?
I was actually getting hungry. I mean, you guys are
talking about Thanksgiving, right?
Jeez. Look, first of all, I'd like to thank you guys for joining us. This has been awesome. You are here at AWS reInvent 22 happening on the floor. By the way, I did capture some content. I'll share at you some B-roll, by the way.
Nice.
We'll share it. But they looked a little sideways at me like, what do you do? And we'll share it at you. But this will make it out. What booth number are you at, and how can people get out there?
We are at booth 425, and Jed and I and John, who's behind us, that you may not see on camera right now, will be presenting at the booth periodically throughout the week.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you guys so much for joining us. This has been awesome to have you guys here sharing your insights and stories. What's happening? A little nostalgia from Jed on it. Hey, we want to go singing after this? Man, we can wrap this up.
That's right.
We can end the night on a good note.
Karaoke.
Thank you guys so much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
And of course, for folks who do want to keep track of this and much more, make sure you go head over to gtmdelta.com/live. We've got a lot more stuff that's coming up the rest of the week, and you can catch all the replays. And of course, follow Mr. John Myer. Make sure you go to John Myer. It's johnmyer.com if you want to see everything from Myer Media. And of course, go to Cohesity.com. We get a lot of great stuff that's going on there. Great blogs too. I got to give a shout out that it's much more than just what we do. And I love that approach again, taking an agnostic approach, and, we call it thought leadership, but in the end, it's like actual practical skills that you can hand to a human and they appreciate it. And the net result is then they look, hey, well, how can you help me solve this problem? Well, okay, now we're having a real conversation, but I love that. Start with first principles. What do we need to accomplish? And let's get it done. So there you go. Shout out to the Cohesity team, and we'll see you all back on the stream. Don't forget, follow the Twitter hashtag, if you're still on Twitter, hashtag LVReinvent22.
It's available on LinkedIn.
We already did. So we will be on Mastodon, I'm sure, by the morning. But at any rate, it's great to be a part of this, and thank you all.